Hey everybody, chapter 7 and 8, recruiting text. I'm going to put these two together because I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Because the majority of both of these chapters are giving you examples that I'm not going to read through. But chapter 7 points out that you should be creating competency-based questions, okay? And that should kind of speak for itself. You should be asking questions based on the competencies that they need to have to perform the job well, all right? On page 121, they talk about those 4 different primary categories: tangible or measurable skills, knowledge, behavior, and interpersonal skills. Obviously, the tangible and measurable skills are much easier to deal with than the other 3. So, for example, interpersonal skills can be very hard to measure. I guarantee you people will say what you need to hear. They know the right words to use to impress you. So if I ask them questions about the last time they had to deal with a problem employee, they're going to put their best foot forward. They're not going to tell you that maybe they flew off the handle, hollered, and threw something. You won't know that till they actually do it. Because they're all going to tell you they're a people person, right? I'm a people person. I get scared when I even hear that phrase. So then they go on to talk about job-specific competencies. This goes back to the work that we've been doing with the job descriptions, right? So I'm having you look at job descriptions, looking at your own, looking at other jobs, and having you write them so that you just should be intimately involved with the job description for any position that you're hiring for. That's why that's how you develop job specific competencies and then therefore good questions. So then on page 124, they go on to give us a huge example here of the whole thing, the requirements, responsibilities. And then they also include, they use all those little acronyms to help identify what it is they're talking about. You guys can read through that. And then characteristics of competency-based questions. The best we can do is to look at past behavior. Right? Past behavior is one of the only real indicators we have of future behavior. Not that we can't change, because we do change. We do change with education and experience. So, but there are certain characteristics of the competency-based question. So as you read forward and like on page 126, they give us an example here. Tell me about a time in your last job when you were given an emergency project with what you believe to be an unrealistic deadline. What did you do? How did you handle it? Now, some of these you'll hear called behavioral type questions or situational questions, right? I don't get too hung up on the terminology. Situational question. I'm going to ask you about a certain situation you may have had in the past that you can talk about. Behavioral. Same thing. Tell me how you behaved in a particular, scenario. Competency-based lead-ins. They have a gazillion examples that you can read in here. When to ask competency-based questions. Again, it refers back to those 5 stages of the interview that I already had you read about. The 5 stages, and then the rapport building, introductory, core, confirmation, and closing. And then they give us some examples there. On page 129, they have that nifty little table there, Exhibit 7-1, the 5 interview stages. And then what I really like about this, and partly why I wanted to touch base in chapter 7 here, is I want you to look at the percentage of time in that little chart there. So for example, percent of time spent in the rapport building, 2%, 3% introductory, 85% in the core, 5% confirmation, 5% closing. And then you can read, then they break it down and you can read more about that. Developing the competency-based questions. You guys need to read this, kind of take your time with it a little bit, because you're going to be developing questions for the interviews that you're going to be doing. And I'm not going to read all these examples to you, but they give you plenty to help start to get you thinking about writing your own questions that are job specific and job description type specific for whatever it is that you're going to create your interviews for. Let's see here. Generic competency-based questions. It's all about finding balance. When you're creating these questions, you don't want too much of one kind and not enough of the other, so it's really just about finding balance. Exempt categories and competency-based questions. Exempt versus non-exempt employees is what they're talking about, and you should have already know what that means. And some of those different areas are decision-making. These are actually some of the real key areas, especially if you're interviewing for someone that's going to be in a supervisory position. decision-making, problem-solving. I'm on page 134. Decision-making, problem-solving, communication, delegation, time management. 5 biggies. These are the 5 areas you really have to be good at to be a good supervisor, and then therefore moving up and becoming a great leader, like a level 5 leader. Okay. Then the non-exempt categories and competency-based questions, the ability to follow instructions, telephone skills, juggling multiple tasks. Those are just 3 areas that they mention here. Then they go into, both exempt and non-exempt categories of competency-based, like the ideal work environment, employer-employee, or coworker relations, things like that we all have in common. That pretty much summarizes Chapter 7. So Chapter 8, additional types of questions. So again, I don't need to go through this whole chapter, but there's just a couple of things I want to make sure that we're clear on. Be careful about any kind of question that you ask that it is not a leading question. And the book does talk about this too as well, but I want to emphasize it. Because right there in that first part of Chapter 8 on page 140, they tell us what the worst question is like, tell me about yourself. Not a good question to ask. So don't ask meaningless information, or ask meaningless questions that can lead to misinformation or misleading information. Okay. Job relevant, pretty basic. Keep it job relevant and you should be okay. Open-ended questions, because you guys are going to be required to write some open-ended questions. So you just read about what those are. Obviously, they're open-ended questions is one that they can't say yes or no to. They have to explain themselves, and they give you plenty of examples here. They even give you the generic open-ended questions relating to work experience. They break it down for you. Relating to education. So this is a great book for tons of examples. There'd be no excuse for you not to be able to write a good question. Hypothetical questions. They give you some examples here. One reason I wanted to touch base, page 145, is just another little word of caution. If you look at mid-page there in 145, although the answers to hypothetical questions can produce important information, interviewers are cautioned against expecting correct answers. It sounds kind of silly, right? But it's not. Without familiarity with the organization, applicants can offer responses based only on their previous experiences. Such answers then are based on how they think rather than what they know. Okay. Then they go on with more examples. They give then probing questions, the third kind, probing questions. You guys will have to write a probing question. They give you plenty of examples there. Then the closed-ended question. Followed by on page 149, questioning techniques for different stages of the interview. So then they give you more examples of, the rapport building stage, introductory stage, the core stage, accommodation stage, and then that's where those percentages come into, and then the closing stage. And then questioning techniques to avoid on page 155. Read that carefully. You just always want to make sure that we just don't stumble and make a legal mistake. It's not as it's complex, but it's not as complicated as you might think once you get in the habit of doing these things. So questions that yield trait responses. That's verbiage, by the way. Blah, 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 blah. People like to impress others with fancy language. I'll tell you a quick story. When I went off to college, we were very, very poor. I'm the first person in my family to ever go to college, and then of course even to go on for advanced degrees past that. So it was completely craziness, right? And I go off to college, and I came home to visit one time, and I don't remember what I was saying or anything, but my mother, who was very proud of the fact that she graduated from high school. My mother, if she was still alive, she'd be 90. She was born in 1924, and a lot of women in her day didn't go past the 8th grade. She was very proud that she graduated high school. I came home, and whatever I was spouting off, whatever, she turned around, she said, "You know what, Roxanne? You do not impress me with your $10 words." Put me in my place, didn't she? So be careful of those $10 words, the fancy verbiage, okay? Loaded multiple choice questions. That's why I don't give tests. Like, they're just... Ugh. It's like there's always a trick question, it seems like, okay? And then leading questions, which we've already talked about. So that summarizes Chapter 7 and 8. All right, till next time.